And I also think it's interesting because the 10-year date of their marriage is coming up, and that is very significant in California. In California, if you're married for 10 years in California, everything is communal property.
Wow.
So it doesn't matter if you have a prenup or not. After 10 years, it's communal property and you get half.
On March 30th, 2026, Chelsy Davy quietly shared a moment that instantly drew attention, not because it was designed to dominate headlines, but because of how effortlessly real it felt, as she posted a photograph of herself holding her third child, a baby boy named Finn, wrapped gently in a white blanket, with sunlight pouring in behind her while she stood barefoot on a beach in Mauritius, creating an image that spoke for itself without needing explanation or amplification. There was no press rollout, no carefully staged narrative, no media machine surrounding the moment. Just a simple, personal glimpse into her life that felt grounded, calm, and completely removed from the noise that usually follows anything connected to royal circles.
And their only deal technically left standing is with publisher Penguin Random House. But I hear that too is over, if only because the two are annoying and can't come up with any good ideas for more books.
And at that exact same time, in the very same week, the contrast could not have been sharper, because while Chelsy stood on a quiet beach holding her newborn, Prince Harry was sitting inside a London courtroom, not surrounded by family or peace, but by legal arguments and unresolved conflict, continuing a long-running battle tied to events from years ago that still refuse to fade. The difference between those two moments says more than any headline could, because one reflects a life that moved forward, while the other remains caught in something that never fully let go.
Prince Harry is heartbroken all over again. Now, of course, this is something that he is never going to admit publicly, especially as his marriage to Meghan Markle crumbles.
And then the situation took another turn when a set of private messages surfaced as part of the evidence, messages that had previously been denied, now suddenly placed under scrutiny in a setting where every detail mattered and nothing could be casually dismissed.
She was love-bombing him, completely love-bombing him, playing along with all their plans at the time.
The language within those messages, the tone, the familiarity, all of it painted a picture of a past that was far more personal and layered than what had been publicly acknowledged, bringing attention back to a chapter of his life that many assumed had long been closed. At the same time, the contrast became impossible to ignore, because while one person from that shared past was quietly building a life,
Diana looked after him like a child. He was a child, but she had to really nurse him and hold him, and he was the damaged child from the start.
expanding a family and moving forward in a way that felt grounded and stable, the other was facing questions in real time, with credibility being examined under pressure in a courtroom setting. And in that single moment, within that same week, the difference between those paths became the story itself, not as a question of what was lost, but as a reflection of how everything changed and where those choices ultimately led.
If there was a willing billionaire, she would only leave for a step up.
That version of the story is far too simple, because this is not about nostalgia or looking back at what could have been. It is about understanding how everything led to this exact point. How someone who once had a clear sense of direction, support, and stability slowly moved away from it piece by piece. This is about a chain of decisions, each one seemingly small on its own, but together reshaping everything, distancing him from the people, the structure, and the environment that once gave his life definition and balance, until what remained looked completely different from where it all began.
Harry has woken up and smelled the roses, and he's not happy because it's not roses he's smelling something bad. Hope.
And what makes this even more striking is the contrast that now exists, because while one path continued forward into a life defined by simplicity, privacy, and a sense of calm that had once been openly described as the ideal, the other path led somewhere far more complex, filled with constant attention, ongoing pressure, and situations that continue to unfold in the public eye. That contrast is what turns this into something bigger than just a personal story, because it highlights how different choices can shape entirely different outcomes, even when they begin from the same place. Hold on to that date, May 2028, because it is not just a random point in time, it is something that could carry far more weight as this story continues to unfold. Something that may connect pieces people are only beginning to notice now. And long before any of this reached its current intensity, there was someone who had already stepped back and made a very different choice, someone who looked at the same environment and decided it was not a life she could remain in. Chelsy Davy saw it clearly, years before most people even began questioning it, describing that world as overwhelming, intense, and deeply uncomfortable in a way that went far beyond what could be managed long-term.
We all know that that's how Meghan is. We've seen it from the very beginning. So to even say that you don't do that when we clearly can see that you have done it, you continue to do it, it just makes you out to be a liar.
That wasn't a passing reaction or a moment of doubt. It was a turning point, because instead of trying to adapt to something that didn't feel right, she chose to completely reshape her path around a single decision, creating distance from that life and building something entirely her own, rooted in a direction that felt sustainable rather than forced. The timeline is where everything starts to fall into place, because this was not a brief connection or a passing chapter. It was a relationship that stretched across years, beginning in Cape Town in 2004 during a gap year that would quietly shape the direction of everything that followed. What came after was not simple or linear, but a cycle of closeness and distance that repeated over time, with both of them returning to each other despite the pressure surrounding them. And at one point, the commitment ran deep enough that she made a major life decision, relocating to England and enrolling in a law program, not just for education, but to reduce the distance and give the relationship a real chance to stabilize. During that period, she stepped into the edges of royal life, attending significant events, meeting key figures, and appearing at moments that placed her directly within that world.
When you look at the one who got away, and she's living the life that you hope to live one day, in Mystique no less, with a lovely man who treats her very well, of course that is going to hurt.
Yet even then, something continued to hold her back from fully embracing it. According to accounts, the same obstacle kept resurfacing again and again, not something personal between them, but the constant presence of outside pressure, the kind that does not fade or soften over time. Reports described intense media attention, surveillance.
Nothing can actually get through to him to be happy now. He just feels it. Everything's wrong.
And a level of scrutiny that went far beyond ordinary public interest, creating an environment where privacy became almost impossible to maintain. And that repeated pressure is what ultimately defined the limits of how far that relationship could go. Her flight details, even down to seat numbers, were reportedly exposed in ways that turned ordinary travel into something closely monitored, with suggestions that individuals could be placed nearby just to observe and report back.
Penguin Random House is done with the Sussexes. It will never publish another book by them. They were financially burned.
And I think Penguin is just so financially burned, they can't imagine doing anything with them again.
Creating an environment where even the smallest moments were no longer private. These are not abstract claims either, because Harry himself described aspects of this under oath, outlining the level of intrusion that surrounded that period of his life and the impact it had on the people closest to him. And this is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore, because so much of his ongoing legal fight is built around the idea that the press destroyed what he had, that constant intrusion made it impossible for that relationship to survive.
So he started having affairs with all sorts of other girls, and she got very upset, and he didn't go and see her for a long time, so she went off and left him. Now that's his fault, 100% his fault.
He has stated clearly that he felt pressure from media narratives shaping his personal life. But when you look closer, the reality becomes more complex, because the decision to walk away was not only about external pressure, it was also about a choice not to continue within a life that came with expectations and visibility that simply did not align with what she wanted long term.
Harry was not in love with Meghan Markle. He was in love with somebody else who turned it down.
The media pressure undeniably intensified everything around them, but when you look at her own words and the choices that followed, it becomes clear that the decision went deeper than that, because it was not just about reacting to external noise. It was about rejecting an entire system that came with constant scrutiny, rigid expectations, and a public role that never truly switched off. She didn't need to frame it as a conflict or assign blame. She simply recognized that the life being offered did not align with what she wanted, and instead of trying to force herself into it, she chose to step away completely and create an exit on her own terms.
She tries to direct and show people what to do because she's a controller, and that's what we see in her body language. That is her showing control, because she is control obsessed. She wants to showcase that image to the world that she is the one who's the boss, but she's not really the boss.
And what followed was not a retreat, but a complete redirection, as she built a path that was structured, intentional, and far removed from that environment, qualifying in a demanding legal field before eventually pivoting into something entirely different, where she could shape her own identity without external pressure defining it.
We always talk about how Meghan's like, they took my voice. Well, she's taking Harry's. She's taking his voice. She's taking, his freedoms away from him to do what he wants to do.
She developed a business rooted in ethical sourcing and long-term vision, focusing on craftsmanship and control rather than visibility, and later settled into a private life with a partner whose world operates far from constant public attention.
She had no intention of moving to South Africa with him and escaping the press and living a private life. All she always intended to do was go to California.
It wasn't about disappearing. It was about choosing a life where privacy, stability, and independence were not exceptions, but the foundation. She chose a path that reflected complete control over her own life, even in the smallest details, from making personal decisions without spectacle to building a family away from constant attention, creating a rhythm that felt grounded and intentional rather than reactive.
This is a man who claims he disowned Charlotte Griffiths when he found out she's a journalist, and he's messaging her about movie snuggles.
Over a short span of years, that life expanded quietly, centered around family, stability, and an environment that supported privacy instead of challenging it, without public campaigns, without carefully staged narratives, and without turning personal moments into something meant for global consumption. And that is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore, because when you place that reality next to what comes next, it does not feel like two versions of the same story. It feels like two completely different directions that started from the same point, but ended in entirely different outcomes.
And this is now becoming a real crisis.
One built around stepping away from pressure and defining life on personal terms. The other moving deeper into a world where attention, expectation, and constant visibility never truly switch off. And when patterns begin to emerge from those choices, it raises a bigger question about whether these outcomes were shaped by circumstance or by a sequence of deliberate decisions that followed a very different path from the start. First came the shift in friendships, and this is where the pattern starts becoming impossible to ignore, because it wasn't just distance or natural drift, it was something much more defined, almost like a line being drawn that separated who remained close and who didn't.
He told Nicklin that he cut off all contact with Charlotte Griffiths the day after he found out that she was a journalist.
One of Harry's closest friends from his earlier years reportedly raised concerns about how quickly everything was moving, not in a confrontational way, but as advice meant to slow things down and bring perspective into a situation that was accelerating fast.
A set of highly inappropriate, very flirtatious text messages sent by the Duke of Sussex to a leading British journalist, which imply not just friendship, but potentially something of a far more intimate nature.
But instead of opening a discussion, that moment marked a turning point, because the result was not disagreement, it was exclusion, a quiet but unmistakable signal that certain voices were no longer welcome. And it didn't stop there, because similar patterns began appearing across other relationships, where the boundaries became clearer and the expectations more rigid, creating an environment where speaking out, even cautiously, could lead to immediate consequences. Reports described it as an unspoken rule, a kind of code where maintaining loyalty meant staying silent, and stepping outside of that meant being removed entirely, not through open conflict, but through distance that made the separation final. And when you look at those shifts together, it stops feeling like coincidence and starts looking like a consistent restructuring of the circle around him. Then came the shift within the family, and this is where the situation moved beyond friendships and into something far more permanent, because even Harry himself acknowledged, on camera, that relationships in his life had changed in ways that could not be easily reversed, admitting that he had lost people along the way as everything unfolded.
These are creepy, very sexualized messages towards a young woman in journalism, and Harry claims, "I found out she's a journo, I pulled the plug," but yet the evidence seems to contradict that.
What once seemed like a tight, unbreakable circle began to fracture, and reports suggested that the distance was not just temporary or emotional, but deeply rooted, with statements attributed to those close to the situation describing a level of tension that went far beyond ordinary disagreement, reflecting a divide that may not be repaired anytime soon. And the impact did not stop there, because it extended into another part of his identity that had once defined him, his military background, where certain public statements sparked strong reactions from those within that community, drawing criticism that focused not just on what was said, but on how it was perceived in relation to values and expectations tied to that role.
Unfortunately for Harry, after just a couple of dates, Sarah and Macklin decided that Harry was too dumb, too self-absorbed, too nasty to date, that she didn't want to date him.
When voices from that world began responding openly, it highlighted yet another shift, showing that the changes were not limited to personal relationships or family dynamics, but were reaching into areas that had once been a source of stability and respect, further illustrating how much had evolved over time. Look, this is where the situation needs to be viewed clearly, without oversimplifying it, because many of the decisions that shaped this path were made personally, and they carried consequences that could not be undone later.
It's usually a 6-month period for Meghan's mask to slip, and then she turns. And you can go in one day and not know anyone that you had been working with weeks before.
No one forced those moments into existence, and no one dictated the direction they would take. But when you step back and examine the full sequence rather than isolated events, a pattern begins to emerge that is difficult to ignore. One by one, the people who raised concerns or questioned the direction things were heading in began to disappear from the immediate circle, not through open debates or ongoing discussions, but through distance that quickly became permanent.
The couple saw their deals with Netflix, Spotify, and Lemonade Media end in the last 2 years, with Spotify boss Bill Simmons calling the two fucking grifters.
And over time, that shift reshaped everything around him, replacing long-standing connections with a different kind of support system, one that operated under new expectations and a new structure. The result is a reality that looks very different from where it began, where even the closest relationships have reportedly become strained to the point of limited or no communication. And when it reaches a stage where even direct contact within the family becomes uncertain, it highlights just how far things have moved from what once seemed unshakable.
He is Mr. Mischief. He's Mr. Traitor. He's Mr. Charlatan. He's Mr. Double Standards. He's Mr. Duplicity. He's Mr. Disloyal. He's Mr. Entitled. He's Mr. Selfish. He's Mr. Big Overgrown Baby. He's Mr. Spoiled Brat. He's Mr. World's Least Happy Millionaire.
That statement didn't come from speculation or outside commentary. It came directly from him, spoken openly in an interview, making it something that cannot be dismissed or reinterpreted, because it reflects his own understanding of where things now stand. And when you place that next to everything that has unfolded, it creates a picture that feels far more complex than a simple disagreement, because it shows how far communication has shifted, even at the highest level of personal connection. Chelsy saw the pressure of that environment years before it reached this point and made a decision to step away entirely, choosing distance before the weight of it all became permanent. While years later, that same system is still moving forward, unchanged in many ways, with Harry now positioned at the center of it rather than outside of it. And this is where the story moves into something deeper, because his ongoing legal battle has become a defining part of his current path, built around a clear argument that focuses on how private information was obtained and whether certain lines were crossed in the process.
They think there are royalties, but there aren't. Penguin overpaid, and with marketing, printing, and other costs, even with millions of copies sold, they will never earn out or get royalties.
The scale of that fight, both in time and resources, reflects how central it has become to everything that followed after stepping away from royal life. That was the foundation of the argument, and in earlier stages, it appeared to deliver results that reinforced his position, with outcomes that were presented as clear victories and settlements that carried significant weight, both financially and symbolically. Those moments seemed to validate the approach, building confidence that the same strategy would continue to hold as the legal battles progressed into more complex territory.
Yeah, he loved her a lot, and she really loved him, and they had great fun together, and he liked it because she wasn't worried about the royal family. That wasn't a big deal for her. She just fitted in very easily.
Then came the next phase, the one that carried far more pressure and visibility as proceedings moved forward into a case that drew intense attention and extended over weeks, with expectations on his side remaining high. The preparation was there, the structure was in place, and he took the stand himself, speaking openly and emotionally, especially when reflecting on past relationships that had been affected by the very issues at the center of the case. But in the middle of that process, something shifted during questioning, when specific topics were brought forward under oath, introducing details that were not part of the original narrative and forcing the situation into a direction that had not been anticipated. Under oath, his version of events sounded clear and contained, describing a brief interaction that did not extend beyond a single moment, presenting it as something limited, distant, and ultimately insignificant, with no ongoing connection or meaningful communication that followed. He emphasized that there was no real relationship, no familiarity that would suggest anything deeper, reinforcing the idea that there were clear boundaries between himself and members of the press. But then, at the very end of the proceedings, when everything seemed to be settling into place, a new element was introduced that shifted the entire tone of the situation, as previously unseen messages were brought forward, not as speculation, but as part of the formal process. And what those messages suggested was a timeline that extended beyond a single encounter, showing interactions that unfolded over a period of time rather than ending where it had initially been described.
Totally miserable, totally allowing his negative past to take over him, all of these court battles, and just a great sense of sadness, actually, and anger connected to him.
The contrast between what had been stated and what was now being presented created a moment that drew immediate attention because it introduced a level of complexity that could not be easily explained away, especially in a setting where every detail carries weight. What followed were details that shifted the focus away from assumptions and into something far more concrete, because the messages presented were not vague or open to interpretation. They showed a level of familiarity and continuity that extended beyond a single brief interaction.
they feel a little bit used. They're using Montecito as a community for their brand, but they're not really involved in the community.
The tone of those exchanges suggested ongoing communication, moments that carried a personal edge, and a timeline that unfolded over multiple points rather than ending where it had initially been described. And this is where the real issue begins to take shape, not in the nature of the communication itself, but in the contrast between what was stated under oath and what was later presented as part of the evidence. Because when a situation moves into a legal setting, consistency becomes everything, and even small discrepancies can carry significant weight. What stands out here is not just the existence of those interactions, but the gap between the earlier description and the fuller picture that emerged, raising questions that go beyond the surface and into how accurately events were represented when it mattered most.
And the predicament that she's in, Paula, is that Meghan might need to go with this book earlier than planned. But if she does that because she needs the money and she's still with Harry, she is going to have to lie.
And this is where everything tightens, because once those statements are placed next to the documented evidence presented in the same courtroom, the contrast becomes difficult to ignore, creating a situation where what was said under oath is now being directly compared to what has been formally submitted and recorded. Observers began pointing out that the newly surfaced material appeared to challenge earlier claims, shifting the focus from interpretation to credibility, and raising questions that extend beyond the surface of the case itself.
Nobody wants to deal with them because, they know that aligning yourself with Harry and Meghan is just going to bring, not good things to come your way because they're so not liked. They don't have a good reputation.
At the same time, the narrative inside that courtroom revealed something even more striking because the references made during testimony showed where attention was repeatedly drawn, highlighting just how much of the past remained present in a setting that was supposed to be focused on something else entirely. And when you place that against the backdrop of where each person is now, the contrast becomes even sharper, turning this into more than just a legal battle, and instead into a reflection of unresolved chapters that continue to echo in moments where clarity is expected most. What happened on that final day didn't just close a chapter in the courtroom, it opened something else entirely, because regardless of how long the official ruling may take, the impact of what surfaced in that moment is already shaping perception in real time, creating a credibility question that does not wait for legal conclusions to settle. And once that kind of doubt enters the narrative, it becomes part of the story itself, influencing how everything that came before and everything that follows is viewed.
When he is rebelling against her, because now I think it's going to be more and more where we're going to see Harry want to try to get more and more of his freedoms back from Meghan.
At the same time, attention has started shifting toward the broader picture, especially when it comes to the deals and projects that were meant to define this next phase, because there have been changes that are difficult to ignore, including agreements that ended earlier than expected and public commentary that added another layer of scrutiny. When major partnerships come to a close and are followed by strong reactions in the public space, it reinforces the sense that things are not unfolding as smoothly as once anticipated, adding pressure to a situation that is already under intense observation. The situation becomes even more complex when you look at how those major partnerships have evolved over time, because what began as a highly anticipated agreement with enormous expectations has gradually shifted into something far more uncertain, where initial success did not consistently carry forward into later projects. While one release managed to capture strong attention, the follow-up efforts struggled to generate the same level of impact, leading to outcomes that did not match the scale of what had originally been envisioned. As time moved on, those changes became more visible, with adjustments to the structure of agreements and reports suggesting that certain collaborations were no longer positioned in the same way they once were, reflecting a shift in direction that signaled a more cautious approach moving forward. And when developments like that begin to stack together, they contribute to a broader narrative that is no longer just about individual projects, but about how the overall strategy is being reassessed in real time, adding another layer of pressure to a situation that is already under close scrutiny. As the situation continues to unfold, attention has also turned toward what is happening behind the scenes in publishing and future projects, with reports suggesting that new proposals have been explored, each aimed at shaping the next phase of public positioning and influence. According to those familiar with the industry, the response to these ideas has not been as straightforward as expected, with indications that previous experiences may be influencing how new opportunities are being evaluated, adding another layer of uncertainty to what comes next. At the same time, when you step back and look at the broader financial picture, it becomes clear that this is not a story about immediate instability, because there have been significant earnings from past ventures, including major book deals, settlements, and long-standing assets that still hold considerable value. But what stands out is not just what has already been secured, it is the question of sustainability moving forward, because maintaining that level of success requires consistent momentum. And when multiple areas begin to shift at once, it creates a situation where the future depends less on what has been built and more on what can still be sustained from this point onward. But when you shift the focus to the ongoing costs, the picture starts to change, because those numbers don't pause or adjust based on headlines. They continue steadily in the background, year after year, creating a level of pressure that cannot be ignored. High-level security alone represents a constant expense, alongside property obligations, operational costs, and legal matters that extend over long periods, all adding up to a structure that requires consistent and reliable income to sustain it.
I don't think that Harry would ever leave those children. And so he's stuck in California, and he doesn't have any friends, really. Nacho is there sometimes, but he also lives in Florida and he's constantly traveling. He hangs out with his security guards and Meghan and the kids.
And when the expected revenue streams begin to slow down or change direction, that balance becomes much harder to maintain over time. At the same time, internal changes have also drawn attention, with multiple departures over the years and structural adjustments within their organization, suggesting a shift in how things are being managed behind the scenes. When long-standing team members step away and systems are reworked, it often reflects a transition phase rather than stability, adding another layer to the overall situation. And beyond all of that, there are also legal frameworks that come into play depending on how long a marriage lasts, where certain classifications can influence financial outcomes in ways that extend far into the future, making long-term decisions even more significant as everything continues to evolve. Harry and Meghan were married on May 19, 2018, and that date carries more weight than it might seem at first glance, because it sets a clear timeline toward a milestone that legal analysts often point to as highly significant. The 10-year mark, May 19, 2028, is not just another anniversary. It represents a threshold that can change how certain long-term matters are handled under California law, and that is exactly why it continues to come up in discussions surrounding their future. Across commentary and analysis, that date keeps appearing as a focal point, not because it confirms anything about what will happen, but because it highlights how outcomes can shift once that line is crossed, particularly when it comes to how financial arrangements may be approached in the long term. And while there is no confirmed outcome or decision tied to that moment, the fact that it is being watched so closely shows how much attention is now placed, not just on the present situation, but on what the future could potentially hold as time moves forward. Meghan addressed the future of their relationship directly in a public conversation in 2025, expressing confidence in its longevity and describing their current stage as something that still carries the energy of a strong, early connection, presenting an image of stability and commitment that stands in contrast to the speculation surrounding them. Those statements were clear, intentional, and designed to reinforce a sense of continuity, especially at a time when so much attention has been focused on external pressures and changing circumstances. And stepping back from all the noise, what becomes more noticeable is not just what has been said, but what has unfolded over time, because when you look at the broader picture, several of the major professional relationships that once defined this phase have shifted, changed direction, or come to an end. That pattern, taken as a whole, raises a larger question about how sustainable the current trajectory is, not based on speculation, but on the sequence of developments that have already taken place and the direction they appear to be moving in. Several of the partnerships that once defined this phase have already shifted or come to an end, while internal structures have changed and teams have grown smaller, creating a picture that looks very different from what was originally expected. At the same time, personal dynamics have also evolved, with distance forming in areas that were once seen as stable, adding another layer to a situation that is already under close attention. And while speculation often fills the gaps in stories like this, it is important to separate that from what can actually be observed, because not every claim carries the same weight, and not every narrative is built on the same level of credibility. What does stand out, however, is the combination of ongoing legal pressures, financial demands, and the broader trajectory that continues to develop in real time, all of which are based on documented events rather than assumptions. Reports about potential future projects and ideas have surfaced from multiple directions, with responses and denials adding further complexity rather than clear answers, leaving space for interpretation. And with time moving steadily toward a milestone that many continue to watch closely, the focus shifts toward what happens next, because with each passing month, the situation becomes more defined, and the decisions made along the way carry increasing weight. There is a historical comparison that continues to surface in discussions like this, one that biographers revisit not as a direct parallel, but as a way to understand how similar patterns can unfold when personal choices intersect with institutional expectations. Accounts from royal historians have pointed to past moments where departures from duty, shifts in public role, and long-term separation from the core structure created a life that existed somewhere between visibility and distance, where recognition remained, but purpose became harder to define over time. Those examples are often described as complex and layered, not because they follow identical paths, but because they highlight what can happen when a life once rooted in a defined system moves into something far less structured. Over time, that transition can bring both freedom and uncertainty, creating a space where identity, direction, and long-term stability are constantly being reshaped. And it is that tension between what was left behind and what is being built that keeps these comparisons relevant, not as conclusions, but as reflections of how different outcomes can emerge from similar turning points. The differences between those eras are undeniable, shaped by completely different contexts, expectations, and opportunities, where today's world offers platforms, visibility, and pathways that simply did not exist before. The roles are not the same, the environment has changed, and the possibilities available now are far broader, creating a landscape that allows for reinvention in ways that were once unimaginable. But even with all of that, there is a deeper layer that continues to draw attention, something less about circumstance and more about the direction a life takes after a defining decision is made. Because when you look beyond the surface, what stands out is not just what was left behind, but what was sought in its place. A vision of simplicity, privacy, and a life that moves at a different pace, away from constant visibility and towards something more grounded. That idea has been expressed openly in different moments, pointing to a desire for calm and clarity that contrasts sharply with the reality that followed. And when that contrast becomes clear, it raises a question that does not fade easily, because it is not about comparing people or situations, but about whether the life that was imagined aligns with the one that is actually being lived. Recent polling paints a picture that is difficult to ignore, with public sentiment reflecting a clear divide that has only become more pronounced over time, especially when placed alongside other figures within the same space who continue to maintain significantly stronger support. Numbers like these do not emerge overnight. They build gradually, shaped by years of public moments, decisions, and perceptions that accumulate into an overall judgment that becomes hard to reverse once it settles in. And that is where the real question begins to take form, not in what the public thinks, but in whether there will ever be a moment of reflection on the path that led here, because over the past years, the focus has remained on legal battles, shifting partnerships, and defending choices that continue to be debated from every angle. At the same time, far from all of that noise, there exists a completely different outcome, a life built quietly and deliberately, aligned with the very things that were once described as the goal. And when those two realities are placed side by side, it leaves one final thought that lingers, because sometimes the most powerful contrast is not what is said, but what is lived. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Palace Loop for more.